research review. So this is, I'm not sure if I'm ready for this one, honestly. So it's the latest Zero research. I'm worried it's going to be a little bit deep because I think Zero is one of my favorite researchers as far as like an interesting, well-rounded character. I like some of his like other writings. He's I don't know. It's very interesting. He finds very cool bugs and he goes very, very deep into these JS frameworks internals, and I'll slow down and try to follow. But I like his tricks. He has a lot of good tricks where he's able to like confuse some state, and he's able to actually use that for caching bugs, and then he's able to turn those into XSS, which like rules. It's very good, and I am always so impressed by it. And his ability, his other writings are really good too. Whatever, we're gonna get into it. So, recache. Excessive reflection type confusion in zero-click SXSS on Next.js. So I'm guessing it's like some way to get some content reflected and cached with a confused MIME type, and now it's served as text HTML. That's my guess. The image. I mean, like, what else could it be, right? And also, that'd be a very Zero bug. Introduction. Unlike our usual publications, this one is shorter and focuses on a real-world exploitation case, rather than pure research. Although the vulnerability was exploited in Next.js, which, as we will see, met all the conditions for reliable exploitation, it stems from an unusual mistake. Mirroring request headers into response headers. This is very interesting, actually, and could be... I have some thoughts here that I'm not going to get into because, honestly, they could probably be their own, Alright, we'll see what's going on here. As the acceptance of disclosure was not likely to happen in our lifetime, we weren't sure if it was worth blogging about, as we would therefore have to anonymize the name of the large company involved. Not being able to be specific about the target isn't ideal, but here we are. It's been a while since we last published an article on cache poisoning, and this case shows this particular mistake leads to systemic zero-click SXSS on the latest version of Next.js. Okay, I'm in. That's very cool. I don't know what the disclosure... How mad is Vercel right now? I don't know. Can I read this? Probably. They won't. I didn't do anything wrong. Override mutation in SXSS. To begin with, one of the first things that caught our attention about this target is that the request headers are reflected in the response headers. When and how? What? Like, why? This might seem innocuous if HTTP response splitting is not possible and nothing sensitive is leaked from chatty intermediaries, although the presence of a Cloudflare cache could reveal certain information, such as a user's IP address. The target runs on Next.js and uses the app router, as is the case with most Next.js applications today. Okay, so maybe they're talking about a specific target that's running Next.js, and this is like a foot gun in Next.js that leads to this, and this isn't a Next.js bug. Alright, that makes more sense, I think. The way everything is written is very deliberate. Right, the latter being the default choice in more recent versions. We quickly tested a technique I'd previously considered in theory and discussed in earlier articles, but had not yet encountered on a real target. Since the application uses the app router, it is possible to alter the response and obtain the React server component by adding the RSC header. I'm sorry, I don't know Next internals. I missed the bloodbath because I was the React to Shell bloodbath. I was busy doing IPC stuff, and so I was like, oh, do I drop what I'm doing and hop over to this, or do I just stay in my lane? I stayed in my lane, and it was so worth it. But all right, so I never really caught up too well on this. And although the default content type of RSC requests is text X component, which makes the behavior inoffensive on its own, URL parameters are systemically reflected in the RSC payload after the __page __ marker. This naturally applies to dynamic pages and not static pages whose RSC payload has been pre-generated at build time and is therefore served from disk by Next.js. These being identifiable via the Next.js pre-render response header. Okay. I don't know what the source would look like for this, like the source code, but the same constraint imposed by the RC content type is also likely what explains why less than and greater than characters are not escaped, as they are not originally intended to exist outside a text X component context. Okay, so you've got some query parameter and it ends up in the response, and it's like, yeah, dude, it's chill, dude, it's text X component content, nothing bad's gonna happen. This is where the previously mentioned reflection of request headers and their response headers becomes particularly useful. By including a content type of text HTML in our request, we can overwrite the default textx component. What? Yo, nice. And then can you get it to cache? Combined with the fact that URL parameters are reflected in the response body, this opens the door to interesting possibilities. Yeah. Not all response headers can be overwritten. Yeah, why does it? Depends on the execution flow and the header consumption logic. Okay, yeah. Once the headers are forwarded, they first go through a loop that sets them as response headers. Yep. Can you have syntax highlighting for JavaScript on his blog? After that, if any response headers from our incoming request are redefined later by Next.js in the execution flow, they will naturally overwrite our value. However, this is not the case for content type, whose value is only set if no content type is already present in the response, which is good news for us. Why? Oh, okay. I see. Okay. Our injected value is therefore not overwritten and allows us to switch the context of the RSC payload to the much more interesting text HTML. All that's left is to craft a small payload to bypass the wild young waif standing in our way. That's a great way of describing it. After that, the response containing both the payload and the overridden content type will be cached. Nice. Dude, I would be so happy if they cached my content. But the question is the incoming content type header part of the key? How is the cache keyed, I guess? Why would it be? That doesn't make any sense. Since the URL parameters are part of the cache key in the Cloudflare configuration, the poison response containing our XSS will be accessible via a URL that includes our payload in the query string. Okay, and so it isn't keyed on random headers that get included like content type. So you make this request with content type set, it caches it, and then whenever anybody else hits that, it'll be like, yeah, here's the item from cache, and it's like, oh yeah, we saved that content type, oops. Right? Maybe. Although the fact that the victim needs to click on a link containing the payload as a parameter may suggest a classic reflected XSS, it is in reality a stored XSS via cache poisoning. That's, yeah, I love sitting down and trying to figure out what type of XSS is this, or is this, it's, you get into some interesting scenarios where it's like very funny to try to like categorize the XSS, and it breaks traditional, paradigms of categorizing it, where it's like, well, it's kind of a reflected stored DOM XSS. In this case, this is a funny way to store it's a stored XSS keyed by a reflected XSS payload, with the response being accessible through a URL parameter as part of the cache key, which in this case is the payload itself. Yeah, that's epic. While RSC is added by Next.js to the very header and is therefore supposed to be considered during the cache's content negotiation phase, this is not the case here. What are they putting in RSC? 1? Okay. This is far from an isolated situation. Cache systems do not consistently honor vary values, as we have observed in some of our previous research, and even if it had been properly taken into account, it would not necessarily have prevented the vulnerability, but this will likely be the subject of a future paper. Okay, I'm sure there's been very interesting research done there. This is good, but not enough. This impure user interaction spoils our exploit and must be addressed. Okay, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah. Shout out Zero. On the road to zero click, we were called CVE 2020 whatever affected prior versions in which the location header is processed by Next.js middleware only if headers from the incoming request are reflected back in the response. This exploit was notably demonstrated in the Integrity Challenge 0825. As you might have guessed, the version of our target falls within the vulnerable range and reflects headers as observed, resulting in full read SSRF. Dude, nice. After a while without success in seeing what we could get from it, we returned to our SXSS. Although we could have simply achieved zero user interaction by pointing the server via location to a host we control serving an XSS payload and forcing it to be cached, we preferred to stick to our initial approach. I wonder why. Is there some limitation there from the program policy where maybe they'd already trying to split behavior here and get multiple bugs with multiple root causes? I don't know. Bug mitosis. Succeeding in building an exploit without relying on SSRF would make the attack viable even if the target were not running a version vulnerable to the aforementioned CVE and were fully up to date. Yeah, okay, so it's probably potentially a program exclusion for known vulnerable components within the last 90 days without patching. I don't know. We therefore decided to find a way to exploit it while imposing an additional constraint. Assuming the version was no longer vulnerable to SSRF, which also proved useful on other targets later on. Yeah, or they just reported this and wanted... I think it's bug mitosis, yeah. Although the location header could theoretically still be leveraged on patched versions, not to trigger a server-side request this time, but purely as a redirection mechanism with the same initial goal of removing user interaction from our SXSS, a problem remained. Browsers ignore the location header when their response status code is not in the redirection range through XX. Well, we could have relied on endpoints that perform automatic redirects by default, such as internationalization routes /en. In those cases, it is no longer possible to override the location value, making the vector ineffective. And even if this had worked, it would have also required the redirect status code to be cached, something that is not uncommon, but far from guaranteed, and no respectable person likes to overcondition their exploits. I mean, if you've got a specific target, you can overcondition your exploit to the target application. Like, what are... I mean... I guess I'm not respectable. Well, I guess I don't, you're not necessarily pumped on it, but it's about getting the bug in, and getting a chain that works on the target put together to show impact. And it's like, even if it is over-conditioned to the target, it's like, we can worry about maybe a more generic version of this if we're looking at other targets that need it. I don't know. I might not have some details here. Fortunately, there is a solution, a small chain involving 2 cache poisonings. Number 1, poison the cache for the target path by altering the response via the RSC header to retrieve the React Server component payload. Embed the payload as a URL parameter value and override the content type as shown previously. So here we're storing some XSS that cares about, I guess this is a fun WAF bypass maybe, yeah. Or what did, hold on. I have to laugh again at how the WAF, a wild young WAF. This is a wild young WAF bypass. And so it's alerting frames.location equals A and then A. Okay, so it's running JavaScript. And what? Okay. Poison the desired page, let's say the home page, by adding the refresh header, pointing to the target site and path, including the full XSS payload as a URL parameter. Okay, so they're poisoning the refresh header. That's beautiful. I love that. Okay, that makes sense. Also, that's so scary. What? The fact, like, that's very impactful on its own. Just the ability to poison the refresh header and have that cached for arbitrary pages. It's like stored redirect. Like, what? So there we go. Yeah, so I like this. All right, you know what? Maybe definitely more respectable. So poison the desired page, let's say the home page, by adding the refresh header pointing to the target site and path, including the full XSS payload as a URL parameter, exactly the same as the last one used. Sorry, I'm recovering from Tokyo. Exactly the same as the last one used when the page was previously poisoned, as it serves as a cache key to access the poisoned response. Yeah, so that's beautiful. It's like stored redirect onto the stored but keyed by reflected XSS payload. The refresh response header is supported by all browsers and allows you to refresh the page or redirect it to a specified URL after a defined delay. 0 in our case. It can be used as an alternative to the location header when dealing with 200 responses, as the location header is not effective on non-redirection status codes, as explained earlier, which also simplify and cache. Do you mean simplifies? Since the non-status code since the status code remains the same. Yes, it's a very great option to use here. Should have thought of it when he said that we can't use location, and I was trying. Great, and there's a lot more research there's a lot more interesting headers you could have cached that would lead to fun behaviors, and hopefully we'll see more research on that. But I have no doubt that he's explored quite a bit of that. As a result, when a user visits targetedsite.com, they are served the previously poisoned cache response containing the refresh header pointed to our poison page. The page then redirects it in a non-technical sense, as this is handled via refresh. Sending the user to the poison path containing the stored XSS, thereby eliminating any need for user interaction. The browser will kindly refresh the page until it eventually lands onto the poison page containing the XSS. Yeah, so this makes a lot of sense, and it's really, really powerful. And he's distilled out the impure user interaction. Beautiful. I mean, I would expect no less. This demonstrates that it is possible when request headers are reflected in the response to achieve a reliable zero-click SXSS on the latest versions of Next.js, even if they are no longer vulnerable to SSRF. For those wondering whether request headers are also reflected in response headers when dealing with static files, they are not in this case. Why are they reflected and why are they being cached? What's going on? I don't understand the root cause of this behavior. Is this... Clearly there's a caching configuration issue like on the target here that's running this Next.js because, he mentioned the variant RSC issues, which apparently don't... whatever. Yes. Well, one might expect this to significantly simplify exploitation by simply pointing the refresh header, particularly for JS assets. True. To an attacker-controlled file containing the desired payload, this is not the case. The header does not appear to be honored by the browser when the resource is loaded via the source attribute of a script tag. Alright, hold on. Okay. There's other headers you can have, though, for those kind of resource loads that lead to interesting behaviors. Okay, I'm not going to speculate on this because I don't know how much of that I'm supposed to talk about. But, however, since the logic responsible for forwarding headers is likely implemented at the middleware level, a recently renamed proxy typically relies on a negative look-ahead to match all paths except specific ones, thereby excluding static routes. Not a strict rule, but it's fairly common. Yeah, okay, so even with the interesting behaviors that are probably possible here, and there's some stuff I would want to test here, actually, for script loads, because I've not actually played with script loads as much, but there's a lot of interesting behaviors with being able to store headers on resource loads. Even if you can't get it to follow a redirect, you might be able to get it to do some undesirable things, although it sounds like it would be tricky to get it to cache headers for static stuff. We did not report this to the Next.js team, as exploitation depends not only on header reflection, which is not, as you will have understood, a particular common behavior. Okay, so yeah, that's good to know. So it was some like reverse proxy or WAF configuration of the target that led to the header reflection. I wasn't sure if it was like some or what. I don't understand what led to it. I might have to reread things. But also on the presence of external caching layer storing the RSC payload, yeah. This latter point has already been discussed with them previously regarding the caching of RSC payloads, and they considered that there is no feasible fix for this issue at the framework level given that various CDNs do not consistently respect the vary header. Yeah, I'm interested in the research about when they do respect it, how to work around it, but as was said previously, the last point will, among other things, be the subject of a particularly interesting future paper. Yeah, I believe it. Conclusion. We were able to achieve a zero-click SXSS on, among others, the website of a globally recognized company providing critical services, whose name we unfortunately cannot disclose. Yeah, the attacker relied on a two-stage cache poisoning chain that exploited a seemingly innocuous implementation mistake, ultimately breaking the framework security model. Very awesome. The SXSS is strikingly reminiscent of the stale Elixir exploit, which also involved a content type confusion and the abuse of a response element being reflected into properties, page props versus RSC payload, originally intended to exist within a safe context. The vulnerability was rewarded with a nice 5-figure bounty. Thank you for reading. So yeah, zhero and inzo. Announcement now open to sponsorships, partnerships, and selective intellectual property transfers related to ongoing and future research. Interested parties can reach out via DM via the email listed on the blog. His way of operationalizing and monetizing his research is very fascinating. Zhero is one of those tech. Maybe one day I'll go to Hippo and try to stop in and meet this guy because he seems right. Okay, so I want to understand what the cause of the reflected. I don't know if the cause of the reflected response headers was mentioned. So it's not a normal Next.js behavior. Maybe it was. Was it a Next.js configuration or custom code that in the Next.js that led to this, or was this at the WAF/reverse proxy level? I don't know. but it's time to pull up the research review points. So how does this generally apply to bug bounty? Yeah, I mean, you have a pretty valid bug if you can get stored response headers cached. That's very interesting. At the worst case, going for just like, well, I can't get content type confusion. Maybe I can't overwrite anything. Just going for that stored redirect, stored refresh header. And there's some other headers I think would be very interesting. Oh man, I want to look. All right, I might look into some of this, but I don't know. It's not normal for me to see a target. I'm honestly not looking for this kind of thing. But seeing the way that he was able to weaponize this against Next.js, very, very awesome in the intimacy there world. Why did this work? I mean, this guy, what? This guy has like so much of the Next.js internals dissolved into his mind that to be able to like take a small behavior like this and turn it into full stored XSS without user interaction required, just caching main page and redirecting to the stored payload. Because this guy is nuts and is very talented and knows how to dissolve applications in his mind. What further research should be done here? Oh man, yeah. I want to play with certain stored headers and see how they behave. And I don't know. I should probably have stuff that looks for this. Like, it's such an easy thing to check for with just like you could have a passive Kaido workflow that every thing. It's so annoying. I don't know. Rating. I rate this text out of HTML out of 10, or text/HTML/10. So that's the rating. And then conclusion. I like that I could understand this one and that it wasn't like super Next.js internally, and it was more just like having a normal web time and just like accepting that sure that's a JSON or that's a non it's some serialized response that isn't HTML, but we can overwrite the content type and we can have the cache store it and we can key back. Like, I like that this could be understood. I don't know, without like sitting in a debugger for a month in the desert and becoming intimately familiar with Next.js internals and fasting and like the like hermetic aspects of Zero's research. I like that I could understand this as a layman. I think that hits on the core points here. This was a really cool write-up. Definitely an interesting behavior to look for on all kinds of targets. It doesn't necessarily have to be Next to be able to have this kind of exploit format for being able to have response headers reflected plus caching is of them with a reasonable key that like a normal browser navigation of a victim could hit. Very powerful primitive, and this is a great way of some clever tricks to exploit it with the least interaction required. So very cool write-up, good research, it's been reviewed.